The Strait of Hormuz is not just a narrow waterway on a map. It is the pulse of the global economy, the choke point through which a fifth of the world's oil flows, a place where geopolitics and commerce meet on the same deck. Over the last 48 hours, that pulse has been stilled for some and thrown into convulsive uncertainty for many more. On April 22nd, 2026, two commercial vessels, the MSC Francesca and the Apameonda, were intercepted as they transited toward the strait. They were rerouted, steered toward the Iranian port of Bandar Abbas, and remain under the control of Iranian authorities. The story that begins with two ships quickly becomes a tale about modern maritime risk, asymmetric warfare, and the human costs that too often hides behind cold strategic calculations. The Francesca was small in crew and multinational. By composition, 4 sailors from Montenegro, including the captain, and 2 Croatian nationals among them. The Apameonda, registered under the Liberian flag, carried 1 crew members, most reported to be Ukrainian and Filipino. Family members, diplomats, and maritime officials described the situation aboard as tense and controlled. According to multiple accounts, about 20 heavily armed Iranian personnel boarded each vessel, restricted the crew's movement, confined them to certain parts of the ship, and kept a close watch. Those on board were reportedly not subjected to physical harm, a fact that offers some immediate relief but little comfort in the long run. Both ships had their automatic tracking transponders switched off shortly after seizure, removing them from the public tracking feeds that crews, companies, and insurers rely on to know where ships are and how cargo moves. In the age of satellite monitoring and real-time logistics, cutting a vessel out of sight is a dramatic escalation, a tactical move that turns a commercial ship into a bargaining chip and a navigational ghost. For mariners, it is a profoundly destabilizing message. Your position can be erased in an instant, and the protections that used to feel immutable on international waters no longer feel automatic. Iran has framed the operation as a justified response, a tit-for-tat reaction to what it says is USS USD, piracy at sea, a reference to a recent U.S. Navy interception and boarding of an Iranian-flagged vessel, the Chushak, in the Gulf of Oman. In Tehran's telling, the seizures are proportional, a form of maritime reciprocity. For others, the actions look like deliberate coercion, the use of naval force and paramilitary units to exert pressure on the global supply chain and to signal resolve. Either way, the effect is the same. Neutral commercial actors are being pulled into great power confrontation, and the usual buffers, flags of convenience, international law, insurance contracts, are proving less robust than many had assumed. The Iranian force involved is identified in many reports as elements of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. In speak, etch, and commentary, some figures have not minced words. One voice described the group bluntly: they cloak their aggression in slogans, but the world now sees them for what they are, criminals on the high seas. Another line, stark and raw, captured the anger felt by many observers. They don't control anything. They're acting like pirates, acting like terrorists. Those are not subtle pieces of rhetoric. They are accusations that cut straight to the heart of how naval interdictions are being perceived, not as legitimate enforcement of law, but as predatory acts that prioritize coercion over commerce. The practical realities are equally stark. Maritime authorities report the 2 vessels are anchored close to the Iranian coastline within Iran's territorial waters, which dramatically narrows the options for any unilateral rescue or interception by outside navies. Once inside those territorial limits, the legal and tactical hurdles multiply, the risk of open confrontation increases. Any attempt to board would risk escalation, and the lives of seafarers become the primary bargaining chips. For families of those detained, the time between successful negotiation and open conflict becomes measured in phone calls, anxious messages, and the slow drip of diplomatic assurances that, for now, their loved ones remain alive. Diplomacy is moving, but it is imperfect. Officials in Montenegro and Croatia have confirmed that their nationals are alive and being held on the Iranian ships, and the governments involved say consular channels and third-party mediators have been activated. In practical terms, that often means quiet negotiation, backroom conversations, pressure through allied capitals, appeals to maritime norms, but it also often means long delays and limited visibility. Neutral states that rely on international shipping for trade and energy now face a thorny calculus, press too hard and risk a rupture that endangers crews and cargo, do nothing and encourage further DTAT. CCTCCCC's watching with alarm. Insurance premiums that undergird the movement of goods are calculated on risk. When transits through a key corridor become unpredictable, underwriters must reprice exposures. For carriers and logistics companies, the message is immediate. Shipping routes that once felt routine now demand additional security, rerouting, or even suspension. Each decision ripples through supply chains, affecting commodity prices, manufacturing timetables, and ultimately consumers who may not see the problem at sea until it is reflected in higher costs on land. Strategically, what's unfolding is a dangerous dance. On one side are naval assets mobilizing to protect freedom of navigation and reassure commercial actors. On the other, asymmetric units are demonstrating they can impose costs by targeting civilian shipping. The transcript we heard earlier spoke of a blockade growing. A second aircraft carrier will join the blockade. In just a few days, that line frames a classic escalation dynamic, a show of force met with asymmetric denial tactics. If a carrier joins a naval grouping, so too may defensive measures intensify, both kinetic and legal, and the possibility of miscalculation rises. There's a broader, more unsettling lesson that keeps surfacing. Anyone with a speedboat, a gun, and the wrong intent can do this. The imagery of small boats swarming larger ships, of men wielding AK-47 SEF and boarding civilian vessels is a reminder that state-of-the-art navies and heavy warships are not the only instruments of maritime power. Our regular maritime actors have long exploited the littoral environment, the narrow seas, the choke points, the busy shipping lanes, turning geography into advantage. When such tactics are wielded by an actor that also has a state banner, the international community senses a double threat, the methods of piracy wrapped in a legitimacy of state action. That sense of a globalized Al-Qaeda is what has many capitals nervous. This is not a localized dispute confined to Western Asia. The consequences are transnational. Tankers rerouted to avoid the strait will increase voyage times and costs. Shippers may choose longer, more secure routes. Supply chains will fragment. The specter of a sustained period of maritime coercion invites geopolitical realignments as well. Countries that feel threatened may lean more heavily on naval partners or recalibrate their energy and trade relationships to reduce exposure to the corridor. Against this backdrop, the human voice remains the most urgent. Relatives of detained sailors tell of nights spent refreshing social media feeds, of phone calls that are brief and reassuring but also perfunctory, of the maddening pace of diplomacy. One family member is quoted saying their loved ones are aware they are being detained yet not subjected to physical violence. That is thin hope in a troubled sea. The emotions are raw and real: fear, frustration, anger, and an aching desire for a simple answer to an intolerable question. When will they be home? This maritime crisis is playing out alongside other, sometimes disconnected but no less significant global stories. Leaders and diplomats are strategizing about where to exert influence next. There are calls to speak with the biggest newsmakers, to talk to Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelenskyy, to manage the risks that stem from land as well as sea. One commentator reminded viewers that the relationship with India is probably the most important bilateral relationship the U.S. will have for the rest of this century. That observation links back to the maritime theme. The Indian Ocean and the subcontinent's naval posture are central to regional security calculations and to the future of global commerce. Domestic politics and mass gatherings also feed into the narrative of rising tension. In northern India, the Kumbh Mela remains one of the largest human congregations in the Asian world, a logistical marvel and a potential flashpoint for public health and security planning. At the same time, internal disputes in places like Manipur highlight how exclusionary politics can ignite local conflicts that, in aggregate, shape a nation's global posture and priorities. These are reminders that the sources of instability are not all at sea. Some begin on the margins of society and then ripple outward. Resource wealth and governance are another thread in this tapestry. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is often spoken of as a country with astronomical natural riches lying beneath its soil. But wealth without stable institutions and fair governance becomes a source of fragility rather than prosperity. The Maritime Seizures are one symptom of a world in which resources, trade routes, and political leverage intersect, and where weaker actors, whether commercial crews or fragile states, pay the price when those intersections are contested. There are also harder questions being asked about the conduct and drivers of foreign policy. A provocative question thrown into the conversation asks, why exactly did the U.S. topple the Sheikh Hasina government? That is not a statement of fact, but a provocative line of inquiry that underlines how narratives about foreign intervention, sovereignty, and influence can shape perceptions and be weaponized in public debate. As journalists and as analysts, our job is to separate provocation from proof, to follow evidence rather than assumption, and to present complex causality with care. Back on the water, the legal frameworks that govern the seas are being stress tested. Flags of convenience, the patchwork of maritime jurisdiction, the accepted norms for boarding and arrest at sea, all are being evaluated under pressure. International law provides mechanisms, but those mechanisms depend on cooperation. When cooperation frays, the law can feel like a paper shield against steel reality. What happens next will depend on choices made in diplomatic rooms and on bridge decks. Will neutral mediators secure the safe return of the crews? Will insurers and shipping companies find workable risk-sharing arrangements that keep commerce moving without subject sailors to unacceptable danger? Will naval forces calibrate deterrence without precipitating a wider clash? Those are the questions that decision makers must now answer, and their answers will determine whether this moment becomes a brief, painful episode or the opening chapter of a longer maritime crisis. For the sailors on the Francesca and the Apameonda, the immediate concern is simple: safety and an end to detention. For their governments, the concern is securing that outcome while managing a complex geopolitical situation. For international shipping, the concern is preserving routes and premiums and avoiding the economic fallout of disrupted supply chains. For navies and strategists, the concern is keeping freedom of navigation intact without slidio, NG into armed conflict. And for the rest of us, consumers, voters, citizens of trading nations, the concern is how much of the global economy we are willing to let be vulnerable to tactical coercion. As the world watches, there are familiar refrains and some newly urgent ones. We hear calls to solidarity and to resolve. We hear the rallying cry, often repeated at political events. For the good of our nation, let's work together and let's truly make America great again. We hear the curt reality checks. Anyone with a speedboat, a gun, and the wrong intentions can do that. We hear the rhetoric that frames these incidents as criminal, and we hear the counter-arguments that insist state responses are defensive or retaliatory. In the center of all of it are people afloat on steel decks, whose names are rarely known to viewers, but whose fates are suddenly of global consequence. This episode is, in many ways, a syllabus for the new maritime age. Asymmetric tactics meet global commerce. Diplomatic meets human anxiety, legal gray zones meet hard-edged geopolitics. The message should be clear to politics. The message should be clear to policymakers and maritime operators alike. The seas remain a domain of strategic contest, and the rules that once seemed settled may need reinforcement or reinvention.